Welcome to ICN Sunday Morning. I'm Vernon Loeb, the executive editor. About a year ago, we hired Lisa Sorg to cover climate and the environment for us in North Carolina. She'd been covering the beat for 18 years. She's enormously energetic, and she knows the story like no one else. And often it's not a pretty picture that she paints. Last Sunday, you may have read the piece about a chemical manufacturer called Starpet near Asheboro that has allegedly been discharging a likely human carcinogen called 1,4-dioxane into rivers that serve as drinking water reservoirs for 900,000 people. The story really struck a nerve with our readers. It got thousands of page views. Lisa, thanks so much for joining me.
Nice to be here, Vernon.
Yeah, so I read your story about the 1,4-dioxane as a kind of metaphor for climate and environmental enforcement in North Carolina, if not the country. On the one hand, you described regulators in the state and some, environmental groups like the Southern Environmental Law Center who are, very much trying to control pollution in the state. And then on the other hand, there are conservatives who are on panels that are part of the regulatory system that are very much opposed to pollution limits and permits for businesses. And thus there's almost a standoff here that's defeating environmental control. And now we have the Trump administration coming in. How am I reading it correctly? And how is the presence of Trump likely to play in this kind of war that's going on in North Carolina?
Well, you are reading it correctly. North Carolina was on the verge of implementing rules for surface water for 1,4-dioxane and placing discharge limits in Asheboro's utility permit. And that would force the utility to clean up their discharge, but also clamp down on Starpet. But none of that has happened. A conservative judge found in favor of the city. The Conservative Environmental Management Commission has now got a majority of conservative anti-regulatory members, some of who are very much in Trump's camp. And you couple that with a Republican legislature, and it's starting to reflect a lot of the Trump agenda here.
Yeah. So North Carolina is really unusual in the sense that it's got a divided government. It has a progressive Democratic governor. It has had for two governors now, who's pro-environment, pro-climate. And then you've got these panels in the regulatory network controlled by a very conservative Republican legislature. Who's winning and who's losing right now?
Well, the Republicans are winning. I would say the environment is losing. So the Republican legislature has an upper hand at the moment. They have vast appointment powers to what appear to the outsider to be obscure boards and commissions, but whose decisions have far-reaching impacts, like the Environmental Management Commission. And in the legislature, the Republicans no longer have a supermajority, which they used to have, but it's a very thin margin, and all they have to do is sway a conservative Democrat or two to their side to override the governor's veto. And this session, the legislature has passed some awful bills, most notably a measure that allows Duke Energy to axe their interim carbon reduction goal. That was supposed to be 70% by 2030. Now it's just, having to be net zero by 2050. By then, if climate change continues at its current trajectory, there will be more parts of the planet that are inhabitable. And there have been other bills, one that puts limitations on rules that would, cost polluters more than a certain amount of money. And, some of these most egregious polluters, such as Comores, it will cost them a lot of money. That's kind of the point. So to answer your question, yeah, the environment is the underdog right now.
Yeah, and getting back to the situation with Starpet, at the end of the Biden administration, the EPA was moving to actually help enforce that permit limit, right?
That's
and
correct.
Now once the ball was passed to the Trump administration's EPA, nothing has happened, and I guess we can expect nothing more to happen on that front, correct?
Correct. It's been radio silence about that particular permit. There have been other situations in North Carolina, most recently in Durham, that they petitioned the EPA for some help about another polluter. Radio silence since the Trump administration. So folks here who are trying to do the right thing are not getting any help from the federal government.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me in editing your piece was that the amount of this likely carcinogen that's in the water supply in North Carolina, we're not only exceeding recommended EPA limits by a little bit. I think in one instance, we figured that they were 1,000,000 times higher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's and the amount that's supposed to, that's recommended for surface water is very small to begin with, which should tell you the level of toxicity. And yes, they routinely exceed this so far astronomically off the charts. And I would add, there are other farther downstream, there are other plastics recycling and other 1,4-dioxane dischargers that also go into the Cape Fear. So it's a big problem along this river basin. It's just terrible.
Yeah. So last year you wrote a series, an award-winning series, I might add, called Gaslighting, that was all about environmentalists working to try to stop this massive build out of fossil fuel infrastructure in North Carolina, pipelines, compressors, a big LNG plant. They were losing that fight as well, I should add. And since then, we've seen this explosion across the country of data center interest and data center development and data center construction. And these data centers are needed mainly to power AI, artificial intelligence, that just sucks up massive amounts of electric power. I think I read last week that AI is now using 4.4% of all electricity in the United States. Is this happening in North Carolina, these data centers?
Yes, in fact, AI and data centers are a main justification the utilities and the natural gas pipeline companies are using to build out the fossil fuel infrastructure. Another thing that's important to note is many of these centers are shrouded in secrecy. The companies are requiring local governments to sign non-disclosure agreements, prohibiting them from even disclosing that a data center might go in. And this occurred in Person County, which of course is ground zero for a lot of natural gas infrastructure. Person County, which is just north of Durham, is where Duke Energy plans to build 2 natural gas plants connected to a new natural gas pipeline. It's where that enormous LNG storage facility that you mentioned is located. It's under construction. And some data centers I've found have actually struck a deal with local governments to keep their energy and water usage also secret. So during a recent heat wave in North Carolina, when, it was like 100 degrees, I received alerts from Duke Energy saying, please conserve energy during these critical periods. And I, meanwhile, was thinking, well, what are the data centers doing? Are they continuing to churn out ChatGPT while I'm, turning off my air conditioner? So I want to add one thing also, though, that, getting back to the legislature has abetted this kind of data center proliferation by passing a law that restricts local government's ability to zone land in certain circumstances to even prevent these centers from coming in.
Yeah, and I guess there's little chance right now that the power going to these data centers will come from wind and solar.
No, I would say likely not. And, for one thing, we don't have we have no offshore wind in North Carolina. We have a couple onshore farms that are very specific to a certain industry, but the solar, we have a lot of it, but in no way could it possibly power these AI centers at this point.
Yeah. Thinking about your coverage, another area that you've broken a whole bunch of stories in has to do with sort of storm recovery and involves this embattled agency called Rebuild NC. that has really struggled to help people recover from, Hurricane Matthew in 2016 and Hurricane Florence in 2018. Is Rebuild at all involved out west now in North Carolina, where the recovery from Hurricane Helene last fall is still very much underway?
Well, it depends on who you ask, but they do have some employees that have been hired from Incor or Rebuild over to the new entity that's overseeing that, Grow and See. However, are questions about how Rebuild is interfacing. We've learned that there's some of their subcontractors were involved over there, but I think it's important to note that Rebuild is not done in the East. That's not to say that, they're winding down. However, that problem is not going away. There are still houses with quality issues, hundreds and hundreds of warranty claims that have to be adjudicated. Legal Aid of North Carolina has filed a civil rights suit against Rebuild in federal court because there was a man who only has one leg. He has several other impairments, physical impairments. And because the contractor built a home that was not fully handicapped accessible, he's had to, parts of his home are inaccessible to him. He's had to use a portable toilet instead of his bathroom because he can't get his wheelchair in the bathroom. The indignity is astonishing. So while Rebuild is winding down, they're not really in the West. We haven't heard the last of the problems at Rebuild.
Yeah, we've grown accustomed over the years to the North Carolina coast being battered by hurricanes. And then we had Helene last year, which hit Asheville in the west, in the mountains in the west, and a lot of people had moved to Asheville thinking it was a climate refuge. How bad are things out there still?
Oh, they're still terrible. I mean, they have removed some debris, but this recovery will take at least 10 years. There are still, if you drive through Mitchell County, which is, Asheville takes up a lot of the oxygen, but there are a lot of really small towns and counties out there that do not have the wherewithal or the political or social capital really to advocate on their behalf. And, there are people in dire straits still. I was just at an event in Asheville a couple weeks ago where people were talking about how they did not want the rollbacks of the EPA's greenhouse gas rules because of what they went through in Helene. They had some very moving testimony. So it's still terrible out there. We don't know what the level of FEMA help will be in the future. We don't know, what the federal government is going to do in general. So it couldn't have happened at a worse time for those folks in the West.
Yeah, I'm really wondering what is going to happen the next time a big hurricane hits, which will probably be any month now, and FEMA doesn't show up, or FEMA shows up at a greatly diminished capacity.
Yeah, well, the state does not have the money to possibly address all the rebuilding and recovery and rescue efforts. I mean, yes, we have great volunteers. We have, Baptists on mission doing home repair, but that's not a long-term sustainable solution. And so I have my eyes on the Atlantic and the Gulf every day, wondering if there's going to be a hurricane coming up this way.
Yeah. Another one of your mini beats, as it were, are CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, these gigantic industrial hog farms in North Carolina. I think there are 8 million hogs in North Carolina,
Yes.
almost as many hogs as people. Yuval Noah Harari, the Israeli historian, has called hog CAFOs humanity's greatest crime because hogs are so intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
Another interesting fact about the CAFOs are that they're owned by the biggest operator, Smithfield Foods in North Carolina, the biggest producer of pork and processor and employer. Smithfield Foods is owned by the Chinese.
Yes.
Which I find fascinating in our political moment. Are CAFOs, you wrote a story recently about lagoon waste from the CAFOs and what will happen in excessive rain or flooding. I'm wondering, are CAFOs becoming better neighbors now in terms of the horrible odors that they've emitted historically and other forms of pollution emanating from them?
I would say on balance, no. In fact, it's a very humid day here in North Carolina. And if you were to drive east into hog country, as I did yesterday when it was also humid, you would be choked by the smell. Even just driving on the interstate, that's how far it gets to you. So the CAFOs are basically operating as they always have. A couple did close after the neighbors won a series of federal nuisance lawsuits several years ago. But largely in North Carolina, the industry is untouchable. I mean, they've gone to the state's highest court to fight groundwater monitoring and certain reporting requirements. We're waiting on a decision from the state Supreme Court on that now. So yes, they are operating virtually with impunity. And let's not forget about the millions and millions of chickens and turkeys that are being raised in CAFOs, many of them co-located on these hog farms, most of which have no regulations whatsoever. And the locations of the poultry farms are secret. So we can't even know where they are in terms of we could fly over and maybe see, but there's not a list, for example, like there are for hog farms.
Yeah. Why is that? Why keep the location of gigantic chicken farms secret?
Well, the poultry lobby has, taken a cue from the hog farms and said, we don't want to, have that level of transparency that the hog farms have. So the only people who have that list is the folks in the Department of Agriculture, state level. They're not subject to public records. The poultry industry does not want to be under the same scrutiny as the hog farms. I think there are people who would, environmental advocates who would say, not only are these poultry farms just as much of a threat to the water quality, what about the bird flu? Do we deserve to have more transparency considering the avian flu that, has been, they say it's not here now, but we have no idea if that's correct and if it's going to come back.
Yeah, yeah. One last question. What do you tell us what you're working on and what's sort of the big story or stories coming up in North Carolina this year that involve climate and the environment?
Well, right now I'm working on a multi-part series about the EP rollbacks of PFAS regulations. That'll be 3 parts. And so many people in North Carolina fought for those regulations. In fact, when they were announced in North Carolina by then Administrator Regan. So it's a huge issue, especially because of the presence of Chemours, which is responsible for the Gen X, which is a type of PFAS in the drinking water supply. Gen X, the EPA has specifically targeted to roll back those regulations in drinking water. So that's a big deal. I'm tracking the fallout from the disintegration of FEMA, and I'm keeping an eye on the pipeline projects, along with just the fire hose of news that seems to be constant.
I am forever amazed at your energy level and and really more importantly your depth of knowledge. You know everybody in the state, you know every issue, and I can't tell you how thrilled I am to have you covering the state for us. So keep up the good work, and thanks so much for joining me this morning.
Glad to do it. Thank you, Vernon.
Okay. And thanks to all of you for reading and for supporting our work at Inside Climate News. See you soon.